He was a man trusted to protect one of America's most famous preachers, a husband admired by his church, a father loved by his sons, a symbol of faith and discipline. But behind the prayers, behind the smile, there was a secret so dark. It would turn his home into a crime scene and his faith into a lie. This is the story of Chris Coleman, the man who killed for image. It was the kind of morning that makes you believe life is ordinary, safe, predictable. In Columbia, Illinois, the sun rose slowly over rows of neat brick houses, manicured lawns glistening with dew. Behind one of those doors lived a family that seemed to have it all: a strong father, a loving mother, and two bright-eyed boys whose laughter carried down the quiet street. Neighbors waved when they saw them. Everyone admired the family's discipline, their faith, their unity. To outsiders, they were proof that goodness could still exist in a complicated world. The father's name was Chris Coleman, head of security for one of America's largest Christian ministries. He was polished, confident, dependable, a man trusted to protect Joyce Meyer, a celebrity preacher whose sermons filled arenas. His wife, Sheri Coleman, was radiant, down-to-earth, and warm. She filled their home with color and energy, photos of her sons Garett and Gavin on every wall, notes of encouragement on the fridge, prayers written on sticky pads beside their beds. Together, they looked like the embodiment of faith and family. At church, Chris ushered people to their seats with the kind of calm authority that drew respect. At home, he posed for photos that would later appear online, his arms wrapped around Sheri, his boys leaning against him, smiling wide. People said things like, "That's what marriage should look like." But behind the lens, cracks were beginning to form, cracks invisible to outsiders, yet loud enough for Sheri to hear. Chris had grown up in a strict Christian household. His father was a pastor. His family's reputation mattered. From an early age, Chris learned that being seen as good was just as important as being good. He craved approval from teachers, superiors, later from employers and church leaders. He learned to wear confidence like armor. When he joined the Marines, that need for control found structure. He excelled in order, discipline, appearance. But he also carried a deep insecurity, the fear of being ordinary, unseen, unimportant. By the time he met Sheri Ware, he had already built a habit of living through image. Sheri, on the other hand, was open-hearted. She met Chris through church friends, drawn by his confidence and ambition. He seemed stable, reliable, a man who knew where he was going. They married in 1997, full of faith that their union was blessed. Their early years were sweet. Sheri decorated small apartments with photos and verses about love. Chris worked long hours, proud to be a provider. When their first son, Garett, was born, she wrote in her journal, "God's greatest gift is the sound of my baby's laughter." 2 years later came Gavin, another light in their growing world. By then, Chris had found his way into security work, eventually joining Joyce Meyer Ministries. It was a kind of job that demanded loyalty, secrecy, and moral standing. He guarded the stage, coordinated travel, handled threats from strangers who resented Meyer's success. To the ministry, he was professional and clean-cut, exactly the image they wanted their staff to project. Sheri supported him through it all: the travel, the long hours, the exhaustion. When he came home, she made sure the boys greeted him with hugs. But over the years, Chris's humility began to fade. He liked the way people respected him when he wore the ministry badge. He liked the whispers. That's Joyce Meyer, security chief. The job gave him attention, and attention became his addiction. Sheri noticed the difference. He had started speaking in clipped tones, measuring his words as if everything were a performance. He prayed less, smiled less, and seemed irritated by the normal chaos of family life. When she asked if he was all right, he blamed stress. When she reached for his hand in church, he kept it folded on his lap. She thought it was a phase, marriage fatigue, work pressure, the kind of valley every couple walks through. But it wasn't. It was a slow unraveling of a man who had come to love his image more than his truth. Inside their immaculate home on Columbia Lakes Drive, perfection was mandatory. Chris expected the beds made tight, the boys quiet during phone calls. The schedule obeyed. Sheri sometimes joked that living with him felt like living with a commanding officer. But she meant it lovingly. She still believed he was a good man beneath the hardness. Friends, however, saw hints of something darker. He corrected Sheri in public, rolled his eyes when she spoke, made small jabs about her weight or her talking too much. It wasn't outright cruelty. It was control disguised as teasing. Sheri's mother, Connie, once asked if she was happy. Sheri smiled and said, "Of course, every marriage has rough patches." But in private, she wrote in her notebook, "He's not the same. I miss when he used to look at me and really see me." To everyone else, though, the Colemans were unshakable. Church bulletins featured them at community events. Neighbors saw Chris mowing the lawn in his ministry polo shirt. They were the couple people pointed to when describing family goals. And that was exactly what Chris needed, to be admired, envied, untouchable. Because the moment admiration faded, he feared. So would he. But perfection is exhausting. And the more tightly someone holds a mask, the more desperate they become to keep it from cracking. By 2008, that mask was slipping fast. Chris was restless, distant, and cold at home, but charming and confident on the road. The stage lights of Meyer's ministry felt brighter than anything waiting for him back in Illinois. And somewhere out there on those ministry trips was a woman who would change everything, a woman who made him feel admired again. Her name was Tara Lentz, and her voice would soon echo in the darkest chapter of the Coleman family story. Chris Coleman met Tara Lentz through the same social circle that had once connected him to Sheri. Tara was attractive, confident, someone who liked to live freely. She had dated before, traveled often, and knew the Colemans casually from high school. When she and Chris reconnected, it began innocently. Light conversation, shared jokes, the sort of small talk that feels safe because it starts with familiarity. But familiarity can be dangerous when it lands in the hands of someone looking for validation. Chris was a man who craved admiration. With Tara, he didn't have to pretend to be the disciplined husband or the moral guardian of a ministry. He could let the edges show, the arrogance, the flirtation, the ego he kept hidden at home. At first, their communication was subtle. Text messages about faith, fitness, travel. But soon the tone changed. Compliments turned personal. Late-night calls stretched into hours. The friendship crossed a line. By mid-2008, they were having an affair. Chris told Tara he was miserable at home, that Sheri had changed, that his marriage was only a formality. He painted himself as trapped in a loveless household, a victim of obligation rather than a husband by choice. Tara, who had no idea how far he would go, believed him. She told friends she'd finally met a man who seemed dedicated and steady. She even said he was planning to leave his wife by the end of the year. Chris promised exactly that. December 31st, 2008, he told her he'd start the new year as a free man. He even described the kind of life they'd build together. A condo in Florida, long walks by the ocean, marriage, children. But when that deadline passed and nothing changed, Tara grew uneasy. Chris gave excuses. Sheri's depressed. The kids are having a hard time. The timing isn't right. Asterisk, yet his messages kept coming, now filled with intensity and longing. He sent her explicit photos, love notes, countdowns of freedom. He wrote that he couldn't wait to wake up next to her every morning. And yet, every morning, he still woke up next to Sheri. Sheri, meanwhile, wasn't blind. Years of subtle distance had sharpened her instincts. She felt it. The late-night texting, the way he guarded his phone, the sudden gym routines that left before dawn and returned after sunrise. She confided in close friends that she feared he was having an affair. One friend remembered her saying quietly, "I don't know who he is anymore. It's like he's already gone." At home, small signs multiplied. His cologne smelled different, his tone grew sharp, his patience evaporated at small things. The boys being noisy, dishes in the sink, a question about a schedule. Sheri wrote another journal entry. "If he doesn't want me, why doesn't he just leave? I'm tired of pretending." Yet she kept trying, planning family dinners, suggesting counseling, praying for him. She still believed he might turn back toward the man she'd fallen in love with. In public, though, Chris still played the part perfectly. He wore his ministry badge like armor. To Joyce Meyer and her staff, He was devoted, reliable, humble. He told them he was struggling with stress, that he needed more prayer, that he and Sheri were working things out. But privately, he was constructing two worlds, one built on appearance and another on desire. He had convinced himself he could control both, that he could keep his family intact while feeding his secret life. For men like Chris, control isn't about truth. It's about domination. He wanted everyone to play their roles. Sheri as a loyal wife, the boys as obedient sons, and Tara as the promise of a new beginning. And as long as no one broke character, he could keep performing. But the tension was growing. By late 2008, Sheri confronted him directly. He denied everything, of course, smiled thinly, told her she was imagining things. He claimed the texts she glimpsed were from colleagues. He made her doubt herself. After the confrontation, he punished her with silence. For days, he barely spoke, sleeping in a separate room. To Sheri, that silence felt like living beside a stranger. One night, she called her mother in tears, saying, "I think he hates me." Her mother told her to stay strong, to pray. Sheri answered softly, "I am, but I don't think prayer is working this time." Meanwhile, Chris's double life was deepening. He was buying gifts for Tara, jewelry, perfume, even plane tickets for future trips that never happened. He kept a second phone hidden in his car, one that Sheri didn't know existed. At work, he bragged subtly to colleagues about new opportunities and big life changes coming soon. He was already imagining himself free, a respected man who somehow shed his past without consequence. But for someone whose job revolved around vigilance, Chris was careless. He left digital footprints everywhere. Browser histories, saved messages, photos that synced automatically to his laptop. All the while, he still stood at the front of church gatherings, head bowed, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer. Sheri watched him from the pew and wondered who she was really looking at. The Coleman home grew colder. Family dinners stopped. The boys noticed the silence. Garett once asked his grandmother, "Why is Daddy mad all the time?" Sheri didn't have an answer. She just told him, "Daddy's working too much." But deep down, she knew something was breaking, something that might never be fixed. For Chris, the pressure was now unbearable. His affair was real. His wife's suspicions were growing. His job demanded moral perfection. If Joyce Meyer's organization discovered he was cheating, he could lose everything: salary, status, respect. To preserve his image, he needed a story, one that would make him the victim, not the villain. A story that would explain away his coming chaos. That story would soon take the form of anonymous letters. Threats he would write himself, warnings from a fandom enemy that only he could see. He thought he was clever, strategic, untouchable. He had no idea he was setting the stage for the lie that would one day destroy him. It started with a single envelope. In November 2008, a plain white letter arrived at Joyce Meyer Ministries headquarters. It was addressed not to the evangelist herself, but to her security team, the unit led by Chris Coleman. Inside was a typed note filled with anger and profanity. The writer accused the ministry of being corrupt and threatened to harm anyone who worked for Joyce Meyer. Chris was the first to discover it. He handed the envelope to his supervisors with a grim look and said, "This could be serious." He claimed he didn't know who sent it. He said he feared for his life. Within weeks, more letters followed, some mailed directly to the Coleman home. They all carried the same style: short sentences, threatening language, vague promises of revenge. One warned, "Tell Joyce Meyer I will use her employees to destroy her ministry." Another said, "I know where you live. You and your family will pay." To outsiders, it looked convincing. Chris Coleman, the loyal guard, targeted because of his work for a famous preacher. The perfect narrative. Joyce Meyer Ministries took the threat seriously. Security was reviewed, travel was adjusted, and local police were notified. Chris filed official reports and even sent copies of the letters to his supervisors. He told them he believed the sender was an obsessed critic of Meyer's teachings. But something didn't sit right with investigators. The language in the letters felt strangely personal. It didn't sound like a random extremist. It sounded like someone who knew Chris intimately. As months went by, the threats escalated. Chris told everyone he was afraid to let his children play outside. He asked neighbors to keep an eye on his house. He even installed new cameras and began carrying a firearm everywhere. Each time another letter appeared, Chris was the one who found it, sometimes in his mailbox, sometimes taped his window, once even slipped under the door at work. Each one arrived conveniently after a moment when Chris's personal life was under pressure, right after an argument with Sheri, or right after Joyce Meyer's office questioned his behavior. He used the letters as a shield, proof that he was a victim, that any stress at home or work came from outside persecution. Sheri believed him at first. She worried for their safety. She prayed at night with the boys, asking God to protect Daddy while he worked. But then she noticed small details that didn't make sense. The envelopes were postmarked from towns near where Chris worked, places he regularly drove through. The handwriting looked eerily familiar. And when police dusted one envelope for fingerprints, the results were inconclusive, smudged, partial, but not inconsistent with Chris's own. Sheri's fear slowly turned into suspicion. By January 2009, the Columbia Police Department had opened an ongoing investigation. They increased patrols around the Coleman home and encouraged Chris to report anything unusual. He began sending the department forwarded emails from a newly created anonymous address that threatened him further. What no one knew was that those emails came from his own computer. The IP address traced directly to his home. Later, forensic analysis would show that each message had been typed and sent when Chris was logged in under his own username. But at the time, the facade was working. His employer sympathized with him. Joyce Meyer herself even offered to pay for extra security. In one email to the ministry, Chris wrote, "Please keep me and my family in your prayers. I'm scared this person might really do something." He appeared humble, frightened, devoted. He played the role perfectly. The good man under attack. At home, Sheri was trying to hold on. She wanted to believe her husband. She wanted to protect her sons. But the house didn't feel safe anymore. She started sleeping with the lights on, checking the locks twice before bed. Some nights she'd wake to find Chris pacing in the hallway, pretending to check windows, his phone glowing faintly in his hand. The letters, instead of uniting them, pushed them further apart. Sheri began to wonder if the real danger wasn't outside the house at all. She called a close friend one night and whispered, "What if he's making this up?" Her friend told her not to jump to conclusions. But Sheri couldn't shake the feeling that the man standing beside her, the man she once trusted with her life, was becoming someone she didn't recognize. Police continued to monitor the situation. On April 27, 2009, officers met with Chris to review the case. He seemed calm but frustrated, saying the threats were getting worse. He claimed the unknown sender had promised a deadline. He was right, but not in the way anyone expected. At the end of that meeting, detectives warned him to stay alert and keep his family close. Chris nodded, thanked them, and said, "I just want my family safe." Less than 10 days later, that same family would be gone. The calendar read May 4th, 2009, an ordinary Monday that would become the last full day of Sheri, Garett, and Gavin Coleman's lives. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Chris went through the motions of a husband and father. Breakfast with the boys, a few quick texts to co-workers, a workout after dinner. To anyone watching, it looked like routine. But inside his head, the plan was already written. That evening, Sheri spoke with her mother on the phone. They chatted about a trip she hoped to take with the boys that summer, and about how Chris had been acting strange again. Her mother remembers her voice, tired, resigned, but still hopeful. She ended the call with the same words she always used. "Love you. We'll talk tomorrow." There would be no tomorrow. The night before, around 9 p.m., neighbors saw the Coleman's lights go off. Sheri tucked the boys into bed, said their prayers, and closed their doors halfway, just the way they liked it. Down the hall, Chris sat alone in the living room, staring at his phone. He texted Tara Lentz, telling her he loved her and couldn't wait to start their new life together. In another message, he wrote, "This will all be over soon." What over meant, Tara didn't know. At 10 p.m., he called her again. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He told her he was in bed early, that he had an early morning gym session planned. After they hung up, he stayed awake, pacing, thinking, calculating. Investigators believe the killings happened sometime between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. The early hours. Inside that quiet suburban home, nothing looked out of place. No forced entry, no broken locks, no alarms. The killer didn't need to break in. He already lived there. They believe Chris began with Sheri. She was asleep in their bedroom when he climbed onto the bed and looped a cord or his forearm around her neck. She woke up, struggled, and fought. Small defensive bruises later showed she tried to claw free. It was quick but violent. When it was over, she lay still on the pillow where she'd fallen asleep hours earlier. He then walked down the hallway toward his son's rooms. First Garett, age 11, a bright, talkative boy who loved drawing superheroes. Then Gavin, age 9, shy, gentle, always asking questions about airplanes. Both were found later still in their beds, covered neatly by blankets pulled to their chins. There were no screams, no noise that reached the neighbors, only silence. After killing them, Chris stood in the hallway, breathing heavily. He wiped his hands, turned toward the walls, and began to spray paint messages in red. Large, angry letters that looked like the threats he'd been receiving for months. I told you this would happen. You have paid the price. Punished. The red paint dripped down the drywall like blood. When investigators later saw it, they would realize the strokes were too controlled, too careful. It was theater, a scene staged for the audience he thought would come later. Building his alibi at 5:43 a.m., Chris left the house for what he claimed was his regular workout. Security cameras at the gym showed him arriving soon after and exchanging small talk with staff. He texted Tara on his way, heading to the gym, "I love you." To her, it sounded ordinary. To police, it later became proof that he was still covering his tracks. Around 6:43 a.m., he began calling home, multiple times, all unanswered. He sent Sheri a text. "Where are you? Wake the boys." Then another, "I'm on my way back." At 6:56 a.m., he called a neighbor, Detective Justin Bila, asking to check on Sheri because she's not picking up. Bila, concerned, went to the house and knocked. No answer. He walked around the back, saw a screen removed from a basement window, and entered. What he saw inside stopped him cold. The discovery? Sheri lay motionless on the bed, a red mark across her neck, eyes half open. In the next rooms, the boys were found in similar condition. Spray-painted messages covered the walls. Threats, curses, and one chilling line, "You have paid." Bila stepped outside and radioed for backup, his voice shaking. Within minutes, Columbia police filled the street. Paramedics entered but quickly confirmed what everyone feared. All 3 victims were gone. When officers reached Chris at the gym to tell him his family had been found dead, witnesses said he dropped his head and muttered, "Oh my God." But he didn't cry. He didn't run to the car or scream or collapse. He simply asked, "What do you mean they're dead?" That calmness would stay with investigators long after the crime scene tape came down. At the scene, inside the Coleman house, detectives worked in silence. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms. The family's 2 dogs were alive and untouched, something no intruder would have ignored. The letters on the walls were oddly neat, their edges squared, each message sprayed at a comfortable standing height, as if written by someone who had all the time in the world. On the kitchen counter lay Chris's laptop and phone. The internet history showed emails between him and Tara only hours earlier. Forensic teams swabbed every surface, photographed every wall, and marked every footprint. Outside, reporters began arriving. By midday, the image of the Coleman home, white siding, red doors, police tape fluttering in the breeze, was on every local station. A perfect family, gone overnight. The funeral facade. In the following days, Chris Coleman presented himself as a grieving husband. He stood before cameras, head lowered, thanking everyone for their prayers. He moved in with relatives temporarily and attended the funerals with dark glasses and a tight jaw. But behind the scenes, detectives were already seeing cracks. He refused to give them his phone without hesitation. He seemed more concerned about how the ministry, would react than about the investigation itself. And when he asked whether Joyce Meyer's organization would still cover his pay, one officer quietly noted in his report, "He appears focused on financial matters." The perfect image had started to crumble. Soon, investigators would begin to pick apart every lie he told. The letters, the timeline, the affair, until the mask he'd built for years finally collapsed. When investigators first looked at the Coleman murders, they didn't rush to conclusions. They had a crime scene that looked almost too perfect. 3 victims, staged threats, a husband with an alibi, and no sign of forced entry. But as any seasoned detective knows, the absence of chaos is sometimes the loudest clue of all. From the moment Chris Coleman stepped into the interview room, something felt off. He wasn't trembling or distracted. He didn't seem shattered or in shock. He sat upright, answering every question in short, careful sentences. "When did you leave for the gym?" "Around 5:45. "When was the last time you saw your family alive?" "Before I went to bed." His answers sounded memorized, too precise. Detectives asked about the threats, the letters, the emails, the warnings he had been receiving for months. He repeated the same story. Someone was after him because of his job with Joyce Meyer. He mentioned crazy fans and religious haters. When asked for proof, he offered the printed letters again, all conveniently stored in plastic sleeves in his briefcase. But something about those letters gnawed at the detectives. The paper, the formatting, even the phrasing, all strangely similar to Chris's own notes from work. They decided to dig deeper. Early suspicions. Police immediately obtained a warrant for his phone records, internet activity, and laptop. What they found started to unravel the perfect image he'd built. The first discovery came from his email logs. The so-called threat emails sent to his personal account came from an IP address registered to his own home internet connection. The timestamps matched times when he was home, not on the road, not at the office. Forensic specialists concluded the messages were written on his own computer. The second discovery came from handwriting analysis. Samples from the threatening letters matched notes and forms Chris had filled out for his job. Experts highlighted identical shapes in his lowercase d's and the long, slanted tails of his y's. When shown the comparison charts, one detective muttered, "It's his handwriting." No doubt. The stalker story was beginning to fall apart. The motive takes shape. Then came the affair. Detectives discovered hundreds of text messages between Chris and Tara Lentz, many of them intimate and explicit. They spoke of a future together, of marriage, of living by the ocean. He had promised to leave Sheri, first by the end of 2008, then again by the spring of 2009. But he hadn't. In one text, he told Tara, "Divorce isn't an option right now. It would ruin everything." In another, "Don't worry, it will be handled soon." To detectives, those words now sounded like a veiled confession. They also found that just days before the murders, Chris had sent Tara photos of engagement rings and condos in Florida. He told her to start looking for furniture. The same night, he kissed his sons goodnight. It was a contrast between those two realities, romantic fantasy and domestic routine, that showed detectives exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Forensic evidence. The forensic team went through every inch of the Coleman home again. Blood spatter patterns indicated that the victims had not moved after being attacked. There were no signs of struggle outside the master bedroom. No defensive wounds on Chris. No signs of forced entry. The dogs, still alive and calm, told them everything they needed to know. No stranger could have entered that house without the animals barking. But they hadn't made a sound. Then came one more discovery. The paint, the same red spray paint used to write the threats on the wall, was found in the Coleman's garage. A receipt confirmed it had been purchased by Chris weeks earlier. He claimed he'd bought it for home maintenance. Detectives knew better. The callous calm. As the evidence piled up, Chris remained eerily calm. He continued to attend press briefings, occasionally appearing on local television as the grieving husband. He even called Joyce Meyer's ministry to discuss whether his salary would continue during the investigation. When one officer overheard him making that call, he noted, "His family has been dead less than a week, and he's asking about payroll." That same week, he also called Tara. He told her, Something terrible happened. Sheri and the boys are gone. Tara was horrified, believing at first that an intruder was responsible. But as detectives interviewed her, they realized she had been manipulated too. She had no idea he was married to his lies until it was too late. The turning point. Detectives decided it was time to test his story. They reconstructed his timeline for the morning of May 5th using phone data, surveillance footage, and GPS logs. Chris claimed he had been at the gym from around 5:45 to 6:45 a.m., but his phone showed activity that didn't match that window. Several messages were sent from his home Wi-Fi minutes before he supposedly left for the gym. A neighbor's surveillance camera captured headlights, leaving the driveway closer to 5:20 a.m., not 5:45. That 15-minute gap was enough time to commit the murders. When detectives showed him the evidence, his calm demeanor cracked for the first time. He looked down, clenched his hands, and said quietly, "I don't know how to explain that." They told him he didn't have to. The evidence already did. The arrest on May 19th, 2009, 2 weeks after murders, Chris Coleman was arrested at his parents' home in Chester, Illinois. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. When officers placed the handcuffs on him, he didn't resist. He simply said, "I didn't do this." But the silence in the room spoke louder than his words. News of the arrest spread quickly. Joyce Meyer Ministries released a statement expressing shock and sorrow, severing ties with their former security chief. For churchgoers across the nation, the story was unthinkable. A man trusted to protect a ministry, now accused of murdering his own family. The reaction for Sheri's family, the arrest was bittersweet. They had long suspected Chris, even before the official charges. Her mother said in an interview, "We knew from the start. He cared more about his image than about them." As investigators continued to process evidence, more disturbing details emerged. On his computer, they found saved web searches for phrases like "how to choke someone" and "how long before you can't breathe." They also found a PowerPoint presentation he had been preparing for Joyce Meyer's team on protecting the ministry from threats. He was literally studying how to fake the very crime he would commit. Every new piece of evidence erased what little doubt remained. The picture was complete. A man trapped by ego, by lust, by the need to appear perfect, willing to kill his family rather than face exposure. The pretrial silence. In the months that followed, Chris refused to speak publicly. His lawyers insisted on his innocence, claiming the police had overlooked the possibility of an intruder. But without fingerprints, without footprints, without forced entry, the theory collapsed. When detectives reviewed his financial records, they found he had drained multiple accounts in the weeks leading up to murders, paying off debts, transferring money, preparing for a clean start. He wasn't planning to rebuild his marriage. He was planning to erase it. By the time the case reached court, Chris Coleman's story had fallen apart completely. The threats, the affair, the alibi, all lies woven together with chilling precision. The mask of perfection was gone, and in its place stood a man hollowed out by his own deceit. The trial would be his final performance, and his last chance to convince anyone that he was still the hero of his own story. 2 years after the murders, the case of State of Illinois versus Chris Coleman opened before a packed courtroom in Waterloo, Illinois. The atmosphere was heavy, a mix of grief, disbelief, and anger. Reporters filled every seat, their pens ready. Behind them, members of the Coleman and where families sat in separate rows, separated not just by space, but by the unbridgeable divide of truth and denial. At the front, under fluorescent lights and the watchful gaze of 12 jurors, sat the man who once protected a ministry and now stood accused of killing his own family. Chris Coleman wore a gray suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his face expressionless. If you didn't know his story, you'd think he was a businessman waiting for a meeting, not a father on trial for the murders of his wife and sons. When the judge asked for his plea, his voice was calm, almost mechanical. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words echoed through the courtroom like an insult to the dead. The prosecution's case. The prosecution opened with a sentence that froze the room. This case is about image. The image of a man who would rather destroy his family than destroy his reputation. Over the next 4 weeks, they built that case brick by brick. They introduced the threatening letters, the emails, and the handwriting analysis, proving they came from Chris himself. They presented forensic evidence. The red spray paint bought by Chris weeks before the murders, the lack of forced entry, and the undisturbed dogs that slept through the night. The timeline told the rest of the story. Cell phone data placed him at home when he said he was asleep. Text messages to Tara showed his mind wasn't on family, but on escape. Jurors listened as the lead investigator described each crime scene photo in detail. The red paint on the walls, the position of the bodies, the calm precision of a killer who took his time. Some jurors wiped tears. Others looked away. Then came the most chilling evidence of all, the autopsy findings. Each victim had been strangled, likely by hand or with a ligature. Sheri had small bruises on her arms, consistent with struggling. The boys had no defensive wounds, suggesting they were attacked in their sleep. When the coroner described the injuries in the children's throats, Sheri's mother quietly wept. Chris didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, hands clasped, face empty. The affair exposed. Prosecutors then turned to motive, Tara Lentz. They called her to the stand. She entered nervously, clutching a tissue, eyes red from tears. She testified about their relationship, how it began, what Chris told her, the promises he made. She said he assured her he'd file for divorce by the end of 2008, and when he didn't, he blamed Sheri, saying she refused to let him go. She told the court about their romantic trips, their explicit exchanges, the engagement ring photos he'd sent her. When prosecutors displayed the emails and texts on a large screen, the courtroom gasped. In one message, sent just days before the murders, Chris wrote, "We'll be together soon, baby. It's almost done." He had killed the fantasy of a life that never existed. When Tara was asked if she had any idea what Chris was planning, she broke down crying. "No," she whispered. "If I had known, I would have run." Her testimony cut through whatever sympathy remained. Joyce Meyer takes a stand. Then came the testimony everyone had been waiting for, Joyce Meyer herself. The famous televangelist entered the courtroom, flanked by staff. For years, Chris had been her protector. Now she was a witness for the prosecution. She spoke with composure, saying she had been aware of the threat letters and that Chris had personally shown them to her. She said she had warned him that if the harassment didn't stop, he could lose his job. When asked if she'd ever confronted him about rumors of an affair, she said yes, and that he denied it. The implication was clear. His world was collapsing from all sides. He was about to lose his career, his income, and the image he'd built so carefully. To preserve it, he had to erase everything that threatened it. The defense's struggle. The defense tried to cast out. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had seen him commit the murders, that the police had tunnel vision. They hinted that a stalker or disgruntled ministry critic might still be responsible. But their theory had holes. No fingerprints, no footprints, no forced entry, no foreign DNA. Every path led back to Chris Coleman. When the defense questioned the timeline, the prosecution responded with a digital map of his phone data, minute by minute. The dots didn't lie. By the time the defense rested, the jurors' faces said everything. The verdict, on May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after murders, the jury returned the verdict after only 15 hours of deliberation. The courtroom stood silent as the foreman read the words. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Christopher Coleman, guilty of first-degree murder. 3 counts. 1 for Sheri, 1 for Garett, 1 for Gavin." The judge asked if Chris had anything to say before sentencing. He stood, adjusted his tie, and said softly, "I'm innocent. I love my family." No apology, no tears, just the same rehearsed calmness that had carried him through every lie. The judge's voice was steady when he spoke. "You are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. 3 life sentences, 3 lives erased." Sheri's family held hands and cried quietly. Chris's parents sat motionless, devastated. Outside, crowds gathered, holding photos of Sheri and the boys, the real victims of a story that had begun with massive perfection and ended in murder. Behind bars, After the trial, Chris was transferred to Menard Correctional Center, a maximum security prison in Illinois. There, he spends his days in near isolation. He continues to maintain his innocence in occasional interviews, claiming police framed him and that someone else must have broken in. But investigators, jurors, and even the public have long stopped believing his story. Inside prison walls, he's known as the preacher's guard, a man who murdered his family for lust and pride. He receives few visitors, no letters of sympathy, no messages of faith. Meanwhile, Sheri's parents have dedicated their lives to keeping her memory alive. They speak at domestic violence events in churches, reminding people that control and manipulation are red flags often ignored until it's too late. They call Sheri the light that ego tried to silence. The lasting image. Even years later, the photographs of the Coleman family still circulate online. Smiling faces frozen in time. To a stranger, they look like joy. To those who know the truth, they're a haunting reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight. Chris Coleman built his life on image. The polished husband, the perfect father, the faithful servant of God. But in the end, that image became his prison. He was willing to kill to protect it. And now he will die behind the bars that image built. The story of Chris Coleman didn't end with a verdict. It continues in whispers, in churches, in homes, in conversations between women who say quietly to each other, "He reminds me of my husband sometimes." Because this story isn't only about one man's fall from grace. It's about the illusion of perfection, the dangerous belief that a polished surface means peace beneath. Sheri, Garett, and Gavin Coleman were real people with ordinary dreams. Sheri wanted to start her own fitness blog, to travel with the boys when summer came. Garett wanted to be a cartoonist. Gavin wanted to fly planes. They laughed, loved, and trusted a man who promised to protect them. But the same man who vowed to guard their lives decided there were obstacles to his next chapter. The image that killed. Chris Coleman's obsession wasn't just with Tara Lentz. It was with the reflection he saw of himself in other people's eyes. He needed to be admired, respected, untouchable. Every moment of his life was performance. The smile at church, the posture in photos, the authority in his voice. But beneath it all was a fear, the terror of being exposed, of losing the status that made him feel powerful. That fear metastasized into pride, and pride turned into violence. He could not bear the thought of divorce, of scandal, of standing in front of Joyce Meyer's congregation as the man who failed. So instead, he imagined himself as a victim of an invisible enemy. He forged letters, painted walls, staged chaos. In his mind, he was still controlling the story until it controlled him. Even after the murders, he continued the act. When police told him his family was dead, he didn't break down. He managed his expression, weighed his words, and thought about what people would see. The performance never stopped. A family strength. For Sheri's parents, Ron and Connie Weiss, grief became purpose. They turned their heartbreak into advocacy, founding the Sheri and Coleman Memorial Foundation, an organization that helps victims of domestic control and emotional abuse recognize the warning signs early. They tell audiences that abuse isn't always bruises. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's the way someone isolates you from friends or makes you question your own reality. Those are the early signs, the quiet storm before the violence. Sheri's mother once said, "If Sheri's story can save one woman's life, then my daughter's life will still mean something." That quote has since been shared thousands of times across domestic violence campaigns and survivor networks. Through their advocacy, the Weisses remind the world that evil can wear a smile, speak gently and pray publicly, yet still destroy quietly behind closed doors. The psychology of a double life. Psychologists who have studied Chris Coleman describe him as a narcissistic control personality, someone who experiences empathy as weakness and truth as risk. Such people crave admiration but fear transparency. They manipulate others into preserving the image they built, and when that image cracks, they panic. In Coleman's case, religion gave him the perfect mask. As a security officer for a global ministry, he was constantly surrounded by moral language, sin, virtue, redemption. But those words became tools, not values. He learned how to perform righteousness without ever living it. To him, sin wasn't wrong unless someone saw it. And forgiveness was something others owed him, not something he owed them. When his secret affair and professional failures collided, he saw only two paths: humiliation or destruction. He chose destruction. That's the chilling psychology of a man like Chris Coleman, someone who confuses control with love and reputation with worth. The reminder we can't forget. Years later, people still drive past the Coleman house in Columbia, Illinois. The house has been repainted. The walls that once screamed in red are clean now, but the silence lingers. Neighbors say the air still feels heavy there. Not haunted, just sorrowful. Every time a true crime program revisits the case, new viewers are stunned that such a man could exist. But detectives, pastors, counselors, they all say the same thing. This happens more often than people want to believe. Behind many smiling family photos is tension that no one talks about. Behind every perfect husband or wife could be someone silently keeping score, waiting to snap. We like to believe monsters look different, that evil has a face we can spot, but most of the time it doesn't. It looks like a church volunteer, a co-worker, a father reading bedtime stories. Until one day it doesn't. Remembering Sheri, Garett and Gavin, Sheri was 31, Garett was 11, Gavin was 9. 3 innocent souls who should have had decades ahead of them. Their lives were stolen not by a stranger, but by the man who vowed before God to protect them. When friends speak of Sheri now, they don't talk about the crime first. They talk about her laughter, her kindness, her endless love for her children. They talk about the way she hugged everyone a little longer than most people do. Her story deserves to be remembered not as tragedy, but as testimony, a reminder that love should never have to survive in fear. The dark truth. In the end, the case of Chris Coleman forces us to ask a question: how far will someone go to preserve a lie? He built his identity around reputation. A good job, a respected name, a clean image. But image can't save you when the truth begins to rot underneath. He wanted to be seen as righteous. He ended up seen as monstrous. And somewhere inside those prison walls, he still probably tells himself a story where he's the victim, still pretending the mask never broke. But it did, and when it shattered, it revealed what he truly valued. Not love, not faith, not family, only himself. Sheri, Garett, and Gavin's legacy, however, is different. Their story continues to awaken others, women finding courage to leave controlling partners, families learning to look beyond appearances, and communities begin to talk about what real faith and family should mean. Because in the end, truth, not image, is what sets people free. Closing reflection. This story isn't just about murder. It's about what happens when pride, secrecy, and ego are allowed to grow unchecked. It's about the danger of loving how things look more than how they are. Chris Coleman's house was spotless, his smile rehearsed, his prayers loud. But love doesn't live in perfection. It lives in honesty. And when honesty dies, everything else soon follows. As we remember Sheri, Garett, and Gavin, let's remind ourselves that no image is worth a life, and no reputation is worth a soul. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who pray the loudest. If this story moved you, if you believe the truth deserves to be told, then don't forget to subscribe to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. Your support helps us bring more real cases to light. Stories that remind the world how fragile trust can be and how easily love can be twisted by pride. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think drove Chris Coleman to destroy everything he claimed to protect? And if you want to go deeper into true crime psychology, hit the bell icon, because every week we expose another case where the mask of perfection hides something far darker. Because in the end, the truth is never what it seems.